What you're about to hear is drawn from the post-war testimonies of American prisoners of war held in Japanese camps in the Philippines between 1942 and 1945. From the written accounts of Japanese officers who served in the prison camp system and who spoke to Allied investigators after the surrender, and from the personal records of men on both sides of a single night in 1945, that most of them spent the rest of their lives trying to find the right words for. The events in this story reflect documented historical realities of the Pacific prisoner of war experience, reconstructed from sources that survived the war and from the memories of men who did not forget what happened to them in the dark. This is not a story about a hero in the conventional sense. It is a story about a man who received a legal order from a legitimate military authority and chose not to follow it, knowing exactly what that choice would cost him, and who did what he did in the middle of the night without witnesses and without any expectation that anyone would ever know he had done it. His name was Captain Kenji Mori. He was 38 years old. He was a Japanese Imperial Army officer who had served his emperor faithfully for 16 years. And on the night of August 14th, 1945, he walked to the gate of the prisoner of war camp he commanded in northern Luzon, unlocked it, and left it open. Kenji Mori was born in 1907 in Kanazawa, a city on the western coast of Honshu that had been one of the great castle towns of feudal Japan and that retained, in the early 20th century, a cultural seriousness and a connection to traditional Japanese values that shaped the men it produced in specific and durable ways.
His father, Hiroshi Mori, was a school teacher who taught classical Japanese literature and who raised his son with the understanding that the highest human qualities were discipline, loyalty, and the subordination of the individual self to the obligations that history and family and nation placed upon it. These were not abstract values in Kanazawa in the early 1900s. They were the operational framework within which a life was supposed to be lived, the structure that gave individual decisions their meaning by connecting them to something larger than the individual making them. Kenji absorbed these values the way children absorb the values of their environment, completely and without examination, because the examination comes later, and the absorption comes first, and by the time examination is possible, the absorption is already complete. He was a serious student, disciplined and precise, the kind of boy who finished what he started and who understood that the quality of his attention to small things was the foundation of his capacity to handle large ones. He was commissioned as an officer in the Imperial Japanese Army in 1929 at age 22, which was exactly what his father had hoped for and exactly what his own ambitions had been directed toward since early adolescence. The Army was the institution that Japan in the 1920s and 30s produced its most serious young men for, the institution that embodied the national purpose and the national character in their highest form. And Kenji Mori entered it with the wholehearted commitment of a man who has found the place where his values and his identity and his sense of purpose align completely. He served in Manchuria in the early 1930s during the Japanese occupation that followed the Manchurian Incident of 1931, and he served competently and without incident in the way that a disciplined and intelligent officer serves when the situation does not yet require anything beyond competence and discipline. He was promoted steadily. He was assessed by his superiors as reliable, thorough, and possessed of the specific quality that the Imperial Army valued most in its officers, which was the quality of absolute fidelity to orders. The quality of a man who understood that the chain of command was not a suggestion, but the structural principle of military effectiveness, and that deviation from it for any reason was the beginning of the dissolution of everything the institution depended on to function. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of officer the Japanese Imperial Army was designed to produce, and it had produced him well. He arrived in the Philippines in 1942 after the fall of the Tan and Corregidor had delivered into Japanese hands the largest surrender of American military forces in history. Approximately 78,000 American and Filipino soldiers who became prisoners of war overnight and who needed to be housed, fed, guarded, and administered in a system that the Japanese military had not fully prepared for because it had not expected to take prisoners at the scale that the Philippines campaign produced.
The prisoner of war camp system in the Philippines was improvised and underfunded, and administered with the specific indifference of a military culture that had deep institutional contempt for men who surrendered. A contempt rooted in the Bushido tradition that held death in battle as the only honorable outcome for a soldier, and that regarded the act of surrender as a form of moral failure so complete that the man who committed it forfeited his claim to the ordinary considerations owed to human beings. This cultural framework was not decoration. It was operational. It shaped the daily reality of American prisoners in Japanese camps in ways that the Geneva Convention, which Japan had signed but not ratified, was not able to reach. Men were beaten for standing incorrectly. Men were starved not as a deliberate policy of extermination, but as the consequence of a supply system that prioritized Japanese military forces over prisoners who were not considered worth the resources their maintenance required. Men died of diseases that adequate food and medicine would have prevented. The death rate among American prisoners in Japanese camps in the Philippines in the first year of captivity was a number that the American military authorities who investigated it after the war found difficult to present without extensive contextual explanation because the raw number suggested systematic murder and the reality was something more complicated and in some ways more disturbing, which was systematic indifference. The death of men not because anyone decided they should die, but because no one decided they should live. Mori was assigned to command a camp in northern Luzon in 1943. The camp held approximately 300 American prisoners, survivors of Bataan mostly, men who had already been through the death march and through the initial chaos of the Japanese prison system, and who had arrived at Mori's camp in the condition that those experiences produced, which was weakened and sick and stripped of the physical resources that the body draws on when it needs to recover from sustained deprivation. Mori administered the camp with the correctness of a man who follows regulations and the efficiency of a man who understands administrative systems, which meant that his prisoners were treated neither better nor worse than the regulations required, and that the regulations required very little. He did not beat prisoners himself. He did not order beatings as policy. He also did not intervene when guards beat prisoners for minor infractions, because intervention would have required him to place his authority in opposition to the cultural framework that his guards operated within and that the institution supported, and he was not yet the kind of man who did that. The change was not a single moment. It was an accumulation of moments across the months of 1943 and 1944 that produced in Kenji Mori a shift in his understanding of what he was looking at when he looked at the men in his camp. He had been trained to see prisoners as a category, as the administrative consequence of military operations, as men who had forfeited their claim to the ordinary considerations owed to soldiers by the act of surrender. What he found himself seeing, against his training and against his cultural inheritance and against the institutional framework within which his entire adult identity had been constructed,
was individuals. He saw a prisoner named Corporal James Whitfield from Macon, Georgia, who was 24 years old and who had taught himself to speak elementary Japanese from a dictionary he had found in the camp's administrative office, and who used his elementary Japanese not to gain advantage, but to speak to the guards as people rather than as authority figures, with the result that several of the guards spoke to him in return, and that the area of the camp where Whitfield worked had a quality of human interaction that the rest of the camp did not. He saw a prisoner named Sergeant Frank DeLuca from Providence, Rhode Island, who was the camp's informal medical officer despite having no medical training, who had organized the distribution of whatever food the camp provided to ensure that the sickest men received the most, who had kept men alive through the specific combination of practical intelligence and absolute refusal to accept that a man was going to die without a fight, that Mori recognized as a quality he had been taught to admire in a different context, and that he found he could not stop admiring in this one. He saw, gradually and against his will and against everything his training told him he should see, that the men in his camp were not a category. They were men. They were men the same age as the men he had grown up with in Kanazawa, men who had families and histories and the specific individual weight of human beings that the institutional vocabulary of prisoner administration was designed to make invisible. Once he saw it, he could not unsee it. That is the nature of this particular kind of seeing. It cannot be reversed. In the summer of 1945, as American forces advanced through the Pacific, and it became increasingly clear to the Japanese military command that the outcome of the war was no longer in question, orders began moving through the Japanese prison camp system that addressed what was to be done with prisoners when American forces arrived. The orders were not ambiguous. They were explicit, and they were documented, and they were communicated through the chain of command to camp commanders across the Philippines and across the Pacific Theater with the specific clarity of military orders that are meant to be followed rather than interpreted. The prisoners were to be executed before American forces reached the camps. The justification offered in the orders was military necessity, the prevention of prisoners from being liberated and returned to the fight against Japan. The actual reasoning, as officers who later testified about these orders made clear, was a combination of the institutional contempt for prisoners that had characterized the Japanese prison system from the beginning and the specific psychology of an institution that was facing defeat and that was responding to the prospect of defeat with a ferocity that had more to do with shame than with strategy. Kenji Mori received the order in late July of 1945. He read it. He read it again. He filed it in the administrative folder where orders were kept. He did not acknowledge it to his superiors in the way that an acknowledged order became a matter of record requiring evidence of execution. He did not discuss it with his officers. He went to his quarters and he sat with it alone for 3 days. And what happened in those 3 days is not documented because there was no one there to document it, and because Mori was not a man who kept a diary. But the result of those 3 days is documented in the testimony of the men who were in his camp and in the records of the Allied investigators who interviewed him after the surrender. And the result was a decision that required him to become a different person from the person his entire life had made him. He began preparing, not visibly, not in ways that his officers or his guards would notice or report, but in the specific practical ways of a man who has made a decision and is working backward from the decision to the steps required to execute it. He identified the stocks of food that could be moved without attracting attention, rice and dried fish and the preserved vegetables that the camp's supply system had accumulated, and he arranged for these stocks to be consolidated in a location near the camp's storage building where they could be reached quickly in the dark. He obtained a compass from the camp's navigation equipment, a standard military compass in a leather case, and he put it in the inside pocket of his uniform jacket where it remained for the 2 weeks before he used it. He studied the maps of the northern Luzon terrain between the camp and the nearest area where American forces were known to be operating, which was approximately 35 miles to the south and east, through terrain that was not easy, but that was passable for men in reasonable physical condition, following a specific route that avoided the Japanese military positions he knew about, and that used the river valleys as navigation corridors. He was not a man who did things halfway. If he was going to do this, he was going to do it in the way most likely to produce the result he was trying to produce, which was not just the opening of a gate, but the actual survival of the men he was releasing. And survival required a route and food and a compass and the specific practical preparation that his 16 years of military training had made second nature. He told no one. He worked alone in the evenings after the camp's administrative day was complete, in the specific privacy of a man who understands that what he is doing cannot be shared because sharing it makes it real in a way that increases its cost before he is ready to pay that cost. He was ready on the night of August 14th, 1945. He had learned, through the same intelligence channels that the Japanese military used to track American operational movements, that American forces were closer than the official briefings acknowledged, that the situation in northern Luzon was moving faster than the camp's military superiors had communicated, and that the window in which the order he had not acknowledged could still be carried out was closing. He also knew from the same sources that Japan was in the final days of a decision about surrender that the Emperor's radio broadcast of August 15th would make official, and that what he was about to do on the night of August 14th was happening on the last possible night before the context that made it necessary would change. He waited until 2 in the morning when the camp was at its quietest and the guard rotation had just completed its change and the men on duty were in the first hour of a shift that was long enough that alertness had not yet been tested. He went to the storage building and he carried the food he had consolidated to the area near the gate in 4 trips, moving quietly in the dark in the way that a man who has spent 16 years in the military moves when he needs to be quiet, which is completely and without the small hesitations and adjustments that produce noise. He put the food in 2 packs that he had assembled from canvas bags taken from the camp's supply stores. He put the compass in the top of one of the packs where it would be found immediately. He had drawn a map by hand on a piece of paper that he had taken from his administrative files, a map of the route he had identified, marked with the Japanese positions to avoid and the river corridors to follow, and a circle around the area where American forces were likely to be found. He put the map with the compass. Then he walked to the main gate of the camp. He took the keys from his belt, the keys that he carried as camp commander, and he unlocked the gate and he pushed it open and he left it open, and he walked back to his quarters, and he sat down, and he did not sleep. Corporal James Whitfield was the first prisoner to notice the open gate. He noticed it at approximately 3 in the morning when he got up to use the latrine and walked past the point in the fence line where the gate was visible and saw that it was open and stood looking at it for a long moment before he understood what he was seeing. He woke Sergeant DeLuca. DeLuca woke the men he trusted most. They moved through the camp quietly, waking prisoners, passing the information from man to man in the compressed, urgent whisper of men who understand that they have been given something that will not last and that must be used now. They found the packs near the gate. They found the compass and the map. They did not know who had left these things or why. They did not wait to find out. 287 American prisoners walked through the gate of the camp in northern Luzon between 3 and 4 in the morning on August 14th, 1945. They followed the route on the map. They moved south and east through the river valleys, avoiding the positions marked on the map with a precision that saved several of them from encounters that would have ended the escape before it reached American lines. They reached American forces on August 16th, the day after the Emperor's broadcast announced Japan's surrender. They were the only prisoners from their camp who survived. The men who had not been woken in time, the men who had not heard or had not believed or had not been able to move, were found in the camp by American forces on August 17th. The investigation that followed determined what had happened and when, and reconstructed the sequence of events with the thoroughness of a military inquiry that understood the historical significance of what it was documenting. Kenji Mori was arrested by American forces on August 18th. He was charged under the laws of war applicable to Japanese military personnel, which included charges related to the general administration of the camp during the years of his command, the conditions under which prisoners had been held, the deaths that had occurred from disease and malnutrition during his tenure. He was not charged with failure to execute the order he had received in July of 1945, because the men who would have been killed by that order were alive and standing in front of the investigators, and their testimony was unambiguous about what Mori had done on the night of August 14th. The trial of Kenji Mori before a United States military tribunal in Manila in 1946 was one of the more complicated proceedings in the extensive program of war crimes trials that followed the Pacific War. Complicated because the man in the dock was simultaneously responsible for conditions that had killed prisoners and responsible for an action that had saved the lives of nearly 300 of them, and because the legal framework available to the tribunal was not designed to handle this combination with the nuance it required. He was convicted on the charges related to camp conditions. He was sentenced to 12 years. The tribunal's written judgment included a section that acknowledged what he had done on the night of August 14th, and that described it in terms that the presiding judge clearly found inadequate for the weight of what was being described, using the language of legal proceedings to address something that legal proceedings were not built to fully reach. He served 4 years. He was released in 1950 and returned to Japan, to Kanazawa, where his father was still alive and where the city was rebuilding itself from the damage of the war with the specific, purposeful energy of a place that has decided to move forward because the alternative is to remain in the rubble. His father didn't ask him about the war in detail. His father was a man who understood that some things were carried rather than spoken. They lived in the same house for the remaining years of his father's life, and the conversations they had were about other things, about the garden and the weather and the books his father was still reading in his 80s. And what was not said between them was as present as what was said, the way it always is between men who love each other and who have things in common that language is not adequate to. James Whitfield went home to Macon, Georgia. He worked for the Postal Service for 30 years and raised 3 children and told the story of the open gate to anyone who asked and to some people who did not ask, because he believed that what had happened on the night of August 14th in northern Luzon was something that needed to be part of the record. That a man had done something in the dark without witnesses that had saved nearly 300 lives, and that the world should know his name. Frank DeLuca went back to Providence and opened a restaurant that he ran for 25 years and that his children eventually took over. And he kept on the wall of the restaurant's back office, not in the dining room where customers would see it, but in the office where he did his paperwork, a copy of the hand-drawn map that Kenji Mori had put in the pack by the gate. A map that an American veteran who heard the story had tracked down in the military archive records and had reproduced for DeLuca because DeLuca had asked for it, and because DeLuca understood that the map was the most precise possible record of what Mori had done. A document that showed exactly how much preparation and thought and care had gone into the act that saved his life and the lives of the men he had kept alive in the camp for 3 years. The map hung in the office of the restaurant until DeLuca died in 1993. His children kept it. They knew what it was and where it came from and what it meant, and they were not going to let it go. Kenji Mori died in Kanazawa in 1981 at age 74. He had never spoken publicly about the night of August 14th. He had spoken about it to Allied investigators and to the tribunal, and he had answered the questions put to him in those contexts with the precision and honesty of a man who had decided that what he had done required no embellishment and no defense, only accurate description. When a Japanese journalist found him in the 1970s and asked him why he had done it, Mori was quiet for a long time before he answered. Then he said that he had received an order and had looked at the men the order required him to kill and had understood that he could not do it, and that the understanding had not felt like a decision, but like a recognition, like seeing something that had always been true become visible in a way he could no longer avoid seeing. He said that he had done what he did not because he was brave, but because the alternative had become impossible, and that there was a difference between those two things that mattered to him even if it did not matter to anyone else. The journalist asked if he regretted the consequences for himself, the conviction and the prison term and the years he had lost. Mori said that he did not think about it in those terms. He said that a man who regrets the consequences of doing the right thing is a man who has not fully understood what the right thing costs, and that the cost is part of the thing itself, and that accepting the cost completely is the only way to do it completely. Then he said he was tired and the journalist should come back another time. The journalist came back. Mori did not say much more. He was a man who had said what he had to say in a camp in northern Luzon in the middle of the night by doing something rather than saying something. And he understood that whatever came after that was less important than the thing itself, and he was at peace with that understanding in the specific way of a man who has done one thing in his life that he is completely certain was right, and who does not need anything else to be certain about.